Dingoes have held a controversial place in Australian folklore. Despite their similarity to the family pet, they're dangerous predators capable of killing people.
Everybody laughed at Australia for building 1,000-kilometre fences, but the resulting ecological impact would prove far more significant than anyone anticipated. What Australia was up against will literally blow your mind. And here's where it gets interesting. The very thing people mocked them for, it ended up becoming a global case study. So, if you've ever wondered how a simple line in the sand could flip an entire nation's fate, or how the rest of the world almost missed the warning signs, then grab a drink, settle in, and don't you dare click away. Let's get into it. Why everyone laughed at the fence. When Australia first unveiled its ambitious plan to construct one of the world's longest environmental barriers, most people didn't quite know what to make of it. Some raised eyebrows, others chuckled outright. Many critics thought the whole idea was just ridiculous. How could fencing off thousands of kilometers of barren outback actually achieve anything? It sounded like the punchline to a joke, not a national strategy. And yet, in 1946, the country began one of the boldest and most controversial conservation experiments in modern history, the creation of what we now know as the Dingo Barrier Fence. Australia's massive fence was once called one of the biggest mistakes in conservation history. Now, it's being called a miracle. So what changed? Watch till the very end, because the truth is bigger than anyone thought. Spanning roughly 5,614 kilometers across the arid and sparsely populated southeast of Australia, the fence wasn't just big, it was colossal. Imagine something stretching from New York to Los Angeles and then curling around to Mexico City for good measure. Made of wire mesh and timber or steel poles, the structure stood about 1.7 meters tall. And its mission was simple but stark: to keep the dingo, the wild dog of the Australian bush, completely out of grazing lands. Why? Because dingoes were blamed for killing thousands of sheep every year, especially in Queensland and South Australia. The idea was that if you could cut off the predator, you could protect the livestock. Problem solved, right? But that's where the real story begins, because not everyone saw it that way. As the fence stretched its way across the red dust of the continent, environmentalists, scientists, and animal lovers began to speak out, and they weren't mincing their words. Groups like the Wilderness Society, the Pew Environment Group, and Gondwana Link raised the alarm. To them, the fence wasn't a clever solution, it was a clumsy overreaction. And, worse still, it was cruel. Vulnerable native species were getting tangled up in the mesh, suffering horrible deaths. Was protecting sheep really worth the lives of emus, kangaroos, and other wildlife? Keith Bradby, the director of Gondwana Link, voiced a particularly haunting concern. He pointed out that the fence cut straight through one of the greatest natural phenomena in the Australian wild, the seasonal migration of tens of thousands of emus. It's like building a wall across a freeway, he warned. They're just trying to do what they've always done, move with the seasons. But the fence didn't care about instincts or survival patterns. It was built to block, not to bend. BirdLife Australia also joined the chorus of criticism, calling the fence an ecological disruption. Their concern wasn't just about animals hitting a dead end, it was also about the ripple effect. What happens when migratory paths are blocked? What happens when animals can't get to water, or food, or mating grounds? The fence, they said, was disturbing nature in ways that scientists were only beginning to understand. And that wasn't even the worst part. Alongside the fence, ground bait laced with strychnine poison was often used to kill anything that tried to skirt along its edge looking for a way through. Steel-jawed traps, baiting campaigns. It painted a picture that felt more like a war zone than a grazing strategy. Some asked, is this really the price we have to pay for a few more sheep? Then came another layer, one that struck deeper than biology or agriculture. Dr. Justine Phillip, a researcher who studied the fence's history, said something that made people pause. She explained that the dingo fence wasn't just a physical line in the sand, it was a cultural one. In some areas, it had been originally used to fence off water holes and keep indigenous communities away from certain lands. It has a violent history, she said, and that hasn't really been acknowledged. Could a fence built with one intention evolve into something more symbolic? Perhaps something darker? On the flip side, farmers and ranchers weren't easily swayed by environmental arguments. To them, the fence had saved their livelihoods. Before it was fully sealed, tens of thousands of sheep were being killed by dingoes every year. After the barrier went up, those numbers dropped drastically. And in harsh, remote areas where livestock are everything, that difference meant survival. But the disagreement went beyond numbers. It was also about how people saw the dingo. Farmers and government officials often referred to them as wild dogs, lumping them in with feral animals that didn't belong. But ecologists pushed back. Dingoes are native, they argued. They're not pests, they're predators, sure, but they play a vital role in keeping ecosystems balanced. Remove the top predator, and you risk letting prey species like kangaroos and rabbits explode in numbers. And guess what? That's exactly what started to happen in some areas. Some experts began to argue that the fence had actually created more problems than it solved. Without dingoes to keep them in check, kangaroo and rabbit populations boomed, leading to overgrazing and land degradation. Could it be that the very fence built to protect the land was now quietly contributing to its decline? Even scientists like Dr. Ewan Ritchie from Deakin University questioned the long-term logic. He reminded people that Australia had tried this kind of thing before, with the famous rabbit-proof fence. And what happened then? The rabbits still got through. So why repeat history with another giant wall? Over time, the fence that had once been ridiculed became something more complicated. It wasn't just an environmental experiment anymore, it was a mirror, reflecting back Australia's changing values, fears, and hopes. It raised big, difficult questions. Can you really control nature with a straight line? Is it possible to protect one species without sacrificing another? And, maybe most importantly, are we always aware of the full cost of our solutions? Today, the dingo barrier fence still stands, stretching across Australia's rugged heart. Some still defend it, others still protest it, but nobody's laughing anymore. What once seemed like an absurd overreach has grown into one of the most significant and divisive conservation projects in the world. It has changed the landscape both literally and figuratively, and forced the country to grapple with questions that are anything but simple. Because in the end, it turns out a fence can do a lot more than just block animals. It can reshape the way a nation sees itself. So now, let's peel back the layers and look at what the fence did. Because once you understand the full picture, it just might change the way you see the fence itself. What the fence actually did. It started as something simple, just a fence. A really, really long one. The goal? To keep dingoes away from sheep. That's it. A straightforward mission with a clear purpose. Protect Australia's livestock from one of its most persistent predators. But what happened next was something no one quite expected. What if a simple fence meant to stop predators ended up splitting the entire ecosystem of a continent in half? What if, in trying to protect one animal, we accidentally rewrote the story of hundreds of others? They say the dingo fence worked like a charm, and by all accounts, it did. Dingoes, the wild dogs that once roamed freely, were nearly wiped off the southeastern side of the fence. On that side, their numbers dropped dramatically. Researchers found only one lonely dingo wandering around, compared to a whopping 85 on the northwestern side. The barrier wasn't just holding, it was reshaping nature itself. But when you take out a top predator, something happens, something big. That's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Without dingoes around to hunt them, kangaroo numbers didn't just increase, they exploded. We're talking about thousands of kangaroos bouncing around inside the fence, while outside, where dingoes still roamed, their numbers barely reached double digits. And it didn't stop there. Feral cats and European foxes, two of Australia's most damaging invasive species, found themselves in paradise. With dingoes out of the way, they could run wild. These two predators are believed to be responsible for pushing nearly 30 native mammal species to extinction. Without the dingoes' balancing presence, their reign went almost unchecked. So what had Australia unknowingly created? Essentially, a giant real-world laboratory, one of the largest ecological field experiments in the world, born entirely by accident. It's not every day you get a line cutting straight through deserts, salt lakes, forests, and rivers, separating one side of nature from the other so cleanly. Scientists had a unique opportunity: observe what happens when apex predators are removed from an ecosystem. And the findings were nothing short of remarkable. For over 7 decades, this unintentional experiment offered insight after insight. Researchers from the University of New South Wales took on the painstaking task of documenting changes on both sides of the fence. They counted animals, set up monitoring plots, and even tracked how plants and soil were behaving. And the results? They went far beyond just animal populations. Even the very ground beneath their feet was different. The soil inside the dingo-free zone had significantly lower amounts of essential nutrients, less phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon. It's almost as if taking the predator out had drained life from the land itself, and the differences kept piling up. Where dingoes still roamed freely, vegetation was denser, about 12% more on average. The soil was richer. Small native animals like the hopping mouse and mulgary had better chances of survival. Even sand dunes, yes, actual dunes, formed differently depending on which side of the fence they were on. How could a predator influence something as massive and slow-changing as a sand dune? Yet somehow, the evidence was there. What once was a continuous ancient landscape, one shaped by thousands of years of uninterrupted wildlife movement and seasonal migration, was now fragmented. The fence tore through the heart of Australia's outback, cutting across 3 states, 5 deserts, and 3 salt lakes. It blocked the flow of water across 77,000 kilometers of interconnected waterways. It disrupted patterns that had existed long before humans even thought about building fences. So here's the big question. Was this really just about protecting sheep? Or did Australia, without meaning to, draw a line through nature's blueprint and forever change the way its ecosystems function? Professor Mike Letnick certainly seemed to think so. He once described the dingo fence as one of the greatest natural experiments in understanding the role apex predators play in the environment. And honestly, when you look at the scale, the contrast, the ripple effects, it's hard to argue. In the end, this wasn't just about dingoes or sheep. It was about balance, about what happens when one species is given too much power and another is stripped of its role. The dingo fence became a lesson, one written across a continent that showed how deeply interconnected life really is. And all of it started with a fence no one thought would do anything more than keep a few sheep safe. The truth hits hard. Ecological fallout. When Australia's enormous fence project was first conceived, the idea seemed straightforward enough. Keep the dingoes out and protect the livestock. It was hailed as a smart, even heroic move, a simple line in the sand, stretching thousands of kilometers that would supposedly solve a very big problem. But decades later, the full picture has come into view, and what it reveals is far from simple or heroic. In fact, it's deeply unsettling. Environmental experts, ecologists, and even local communities are now grappling with the unintended consequences of a decision that altered not just landscapes, but entire ecosystems. So, what really happens when you try to outsmart nature with a wall? At first glance, the fence served its purpose. Livestock were safer, and farmers felt more secure. But as time passed, people began to notice things weren't quite right on the other side of the barrier. Without the dingoes, nature's apex predator in many parts of the Australian outback, a dangerous imbalance began to form. And it wasn't long before kangaroos, once gracefully hopping across the bush in modest numbers, became more like a crowd out of control. Left unchecked, their population surged inside the fenced zone. During seasons of plentiful rain and vegetation, they bred rapidly. But then came the droughts, Australia's all-too-familiar dry spells, and the very same kangaroos that had flourished were now dying en masse. Reports from ecologists were heartbreaking. Some estimated that up to 80 or even 90% of kangaroos in certain regions perished from starvation during tough years. Imagine the scale of that. Millions of animals suffering quietly in remote corners of the country. And the stories are hard to shake off. Desperate kangaroos reportedly resorted to bizarre behaviors. Some were found eating toilet paper in public restrooms. Others lay lifeless on roadsides, their frail bodies barely able to move, while their joeys clung to them, still trying to feed. What kind of desperation drives a wild animal to such acts? It wasn't just about numbers, it was about suffering. Nature wasn't just out of balance, it was in crisis. To make matters worse, climate patterns in recent years have created ideal conditions for kangaroos to breed even more. Some experts are sounding the alarm that Australia could soon be home to over 60 million kangaroos. That's more than double the human population of the country. And if you think that's just a figure on paper, think again. This overpopulation has very real consequences, not just for the kangaroos, but for the land, the farmers, and other species struggling to survive. What's even more fascinating, and perhaps eerie, is how this fence has affected kangaroo development itself. Scientists have noticed that young red kangaroos growing up inside the fence develop more slowly than those outside. Why? Because they don't need to be fast. They don't have dingoes chasing them. There's no predator keeping them sharp, agile, or cautious. In a strange twist, the absence of fear has stunted their natural development. So, was the safety really a gift or a trap? But kangaroos aren't the only ones affected. The loss of the dingo has triggered a cascade effect across the region. Australia's biodiversity has long been unique, full of creatures found nowhere else on Earth. But now, that uniqueness is under threat. Over the last 2 centuries, more mammal species have gone extinct in Australia than in any other country. That's not just an unfortunate statistic. It's 1/3 of all mammal extinctions worldwide in the last 500 years. Let that sink in for a moment. Think about what it means to lose an entire species forever, and then realize that it's happened again and again, largely on the same continent. And what about the predators that filled the gap left behind by the dingoes? Well, nature abhors a vacuum, and into that space rushed invaders. Feral cats and European foxes, both introduced species, have become dominant forces within the fence. Without dingoes to control or intimidate them, their populations exploded. Unlike the dingoes, these predators are particularly lethal to smaller native animals. Feral cats, for instance, have been linked to the extinction of 29 native mammal species. These animals don't just hunt to survive, they overhunt, pushing fragile species to the brink. Professor Letnick, a leading ecologist, didn't mince words when he said the problem is especially dire in desert regions, and worst of all, inside the fenced areas. Dingoes, it turns out, played a far more crucial role in the ecosystem than anyone initially gave them credit for. They didn't just eat, they managed. They kept foxes away. They limited the spread of feral cats, and they indirectly protected smaller animals. Remove them, and the whole structure begins to crumble. This phenomenon has a name. It's called a trophic cascade. It means that when you take out a top predator, the effects ripple through every layer of the food web. Some changes are visible, others are subtle, but just as damaging. As one ecologist put it with painful honesty, one of the things that makes me really sad when I come out to places like this in the desert is that I know that I've only got the opportunity to see a small fraction of the animals that once lived here. So, in trying to fix one problem, did we create several more? And when the balance tips, the fallout can be impossible to undo. Stick around till the very end, because this story gets more interesting as we uncover the science behind the shift. The science behind the shift. When scientists began digging into the ecological consequences of Australia's massive dingo fence, yes, that seemingly endless barrier stretching over thousands of kilometers, they didn't just stumble upon a few scattered clues about wildlife behavior. They unearthed a complete crash course in how nature works when a key player is removed. So, what really happens when a top predator like the dingo is cut off from a vast ecosystem? As it turns out, a whole lot more than anyone might expect. Researchers found themselves face to face with what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a fancy term that boils down to this: when a top predator disappears, everything beneath it in the food web starts to unravel piece by piece. And the dingo fence, it's become a real-life science lab showing this phenomenon in high definition. In a way, it's similar to what happened in Yellowstone National Park after wolves were reintroduced there in the 1920s. Take away the predator, and the balance crumbles. Put it back in, and the system begins to heal. But unlike Yellowstone's restoration, Australia's fence told the story in reverse. Without dingoes to keep them in check, kangaroo numbers skyrocketed inside the fence. That might sound cute at first. Who wouldn't want more kangaroos hopping around? But it didn't take long for scientists to realize that this explosion in kangaroo populations had a dark side. These marsupials started overgrazing the vegetation, chomping through plant life like there was no tomorrow. And that wasn't just bad news for the plants. It affected the entire chain of life. The plants that disappeared were often the ones that provided cover or food for insects, birds, and smaller mammals. Over time, entire communities of species began shifting, and the ecosystem inside the fence slowly morphed into something completely different from what existed just meters away on the other side. But here's where things get even more mind-blowing. The changes didn't just stop with the plants or the animals. Scientists were stunned to find that the soil itself had changed. Yes, the dirt. Areas inside the fence, where dingoes were nearly extinct, had lower levels of critical nutrients like phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon. Why would the absence of one predator affect the very foundation of the earth? The answer is hidden in a chain of cause and effect. More kangaroos meant more grazing, which meant less plant cover, which meant less organic matter falling to the ground, which meant more erosion. With wind and rain having an easier time stripping the land, the soil degraded faster, and the landscape suffered. It's the kind of connection that makes you ask, who knew dingoes were unknowingly protecting the dirt? The contrast was so dramatic that even satellites could spot it from space. Researchers compared decades of satellite imagery, 32 years' worth, to be exact, and found that vegetation patterns were starkly different on either side of the fence. You didn't need to be a botanist to notice it. Inside the fence, where dingoes were nearly non-existent, researchers counted over 3,000 kangaroos and just one dingo. Outside, it was a completely different picture. Only 8 kangaroos, but 85 dingoes. That's not just a population difference, that's a transformation. Now, just when you think things couldn't get any more fascinating, the story turns to the kangaroos themselves. Scientists noticed something peculiar about the way young red kangaroos were growing. Those living outside the fence, where dingoes roamed freely, were growing faster than the ones inside. And this wasn't a small difference. It was significant. Juvenile kangaroos in predator-free zones were lighter and smaller at the same age compared to their cousins outside the fence. So, what was going on? Were they not getting enough to eat? Surprisingly, the answer was no. In fact, there was less vegetation inside the fence, not more. The difference wasn't about food, it was about survival. Scientists believe the faster growth rate of kangaroos outside the fence is actually an evolutionary response. The idea is that these kangaroos grow quickly to pass through the size range that makes them most vulnerable to predators like dingoes. Think about that for a second. an animal adapting its growth pattern over generations just to reduce the risk of getting eaten. How incredible is that? And it didn't take millions of years for this change to happen either. Researchers believe this adaptation may have developed over just 17 generations of kangaroos. That's a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. It's proof that nature doesn't always need eons to react. It can shift remarkably fast when the pressure is intense enough. What happens next? Australia, a land known for its vast outback and rugged wilderness, has long relied on a controversial structure that winds across its terrain like a scar, the dingo fence. Originally built to protect livestock from predation, this enormous barrier stretches for thousands of kilometers, silently dividing ecosystems and reshaping the land's natural order. But now, as scientific understanding deepens and ecological awareness grows, a new question echoes through conservation circles and political halls alike. Should Australia hold on to this monumental fence, modify it for modern needs, or dismantle it altogether? That's not a simple question to answer, not when history, culture, economy, and nature are so tightly woven into the wire. For some, the fence is a necessary evil. For others, it's an outdated relic of colonial control. Researchers and environmentalists have begun to speak more openly about the costs that go beyond just dollars and cents. People like Dr. Justine Phillip have been vocal, pointing out that the dingo fence isn't just a physical boundary, it's symbolic, a cultural barrier built on what she calls a violent history. Her words prompt us to consider, if the land remembers, what story is this fence still telling? According to many ecologists, this story is no longer one of protection and progress, but of unintended consequences and environmental imbalance. They argue that the fence, once constructed to safeguard livestock, may now be doing more harm than good, especially in a warming world where climate change is transforming once arable sheep grazing zones into inhospitable deserts. So, they ask, does it still make sense to keep investing in a structure that might already be obsolete? And yet, despite growing criticism, governments are pushing ahead with expansion plans. New South Wales has allocated a staggering $37.5 million to extend the fence by another 742 kilometers, while South Australia is funneling $25 million into rebuilding its segment. Maintenance alone chews through around $10 million each year. This kind of spending raises another difficult question. Is this really the best use of public funds in a time when biodiversity loss and climate resilience are urgent priorities? Interestingly, while traditional fencing continues, newer technologies are quietly making their way into the conversation. Australia has started experimenting with smarter, more adaptive methods, tools that don't require kilometers of wire to get the job done. Innovations like electrification monitoring apps, camera systems at gates, and drones capable of rapid fence inspections during floods are already streamlining how these barriers are managed. Even more futuristic is the idea of virtual fencing, using GPS signals to guide livestock without any physical barriers at all. It sounds like science fiction, but is it perhaps the practical, forward-looking solution Australia needs? Meanwhile, the nation's broader conservation vision is shifting. Under the Strategy for Nature 2024 to 2030, Australia has committed to reversing biodiversity decline. But reversing decline requires more than policy papers. It demands real change on the ground. That includes setting up ways to track progress, empower local communities, and invite businesses into the fold of environmental stewardship. Can a fence that blocks wildlife migration really align with a strategy focused on ecological healing? Farmers, too, are looking for that sweet spot between production and preservation. In Queensland, some have turned to guardian dogs, like the dependable Maremma breed, to protect sheep from predators, effectively sidestepping the need for fencing altogether. As Professor Ritchie puts it, it's entirely possible to have apex predators like dingoes on the land and still run productive farms. Isn't that kind of coexistence worth exploring further? Then there are more targeted efforts like wildlife-friendly fencing, promoted by the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. These are fences designed not just to keep livestock in or predators out, but to reduce harm to native wildlife. It's heartbreaking to think that every year, thousands of animals from over 70 species die tangled in fences they were never meant to navigate. Doesn't that suggest it's time to redesign with all creatures in mind? But perhaps the most profound shift is the growing acknowledgement that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities must lead the way in restoring Australia's natural landscapes. Their knowledge of country, accumulated over millennia, offers insights that Western science alone cannot replicate. As one report simply states, healthy country means healthy people. That idea carries immense weight, because if healing the land also heals communities, isn't that a future we should be striving for together? So here Australia stands, at a crossroads. On one side lies tradition, the fence, the livestock, the status quo. On the other, a path lined with innovation, ecological restoration, and Indigenous leadership. The road forward won't be easy. There are livelihoods at stake, histories to reconcile, and ecosystems to rebalance. But with careful thought, honest dialogue, and a willingness to rethink old systems, there's hope for a new kind of balance. The kind where the needs of nature and the demands of agriculture no longer exist in opposition, but side by side, like two neighbors sharing the same fence line, not divided by it. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.